My name is Julia Sandoval. I'm 36 years old living in Boston, a city where everyone believes the law protects the truth, but no one ever told me that sometimes the truth is what costs you everything. That afternoon I came home to find my car keys. The bedroom door was slightly ajar. Soft laughter echoed from inside. My husband's voice. And my cousin's. Caroline. I thought I misheard until she said, she has no idea, still thinks her birth mother died of heart disease. That's when I realized. I hadn't lost my husband. I had lost my past. Have you ever discovered that your life was built on a script of lies? Leave a comment below, hit like if you've ever felt betrayed, and subscribe to hear the next part, where I tell you how I turned pain into justice. This isn't a story about revenge. It's how one daughter forced an entire family to face a truth they buried for 30 years. I grew up in a classic brick townhouse in Beacon Hill, where the granite steps seemed to hold the footsteps of an older generation. People used to say I was lucky, the only daughter of Richard Sandoval, a renowned Harvard law professor, and Lorraine, his second wife, always impeccably dressed in cream-colored suits and heels that never seemed to collect dust. I called Lorraine Mom from the time I could speak, though deep down the word always landed with a hollow thud. My birth mother, Maria Elena, died when I was 6 months old. Every memory I had of her came from a faded photo on the mantel, and the occasional quiet line from my father, "Your mother was gentle, like you." But I was never sure he truly saw the resemblance. Lorraine entered my life when I was 2. They married quickly, in a small ceremony I only know about because of an old wedding invitation tucked in a drawer. She did everything a mother was supposed to, taught me how to tie my hair neatly for school, matched my shoes to the seasons, forced piano and French lessons on me like any good Boston debutante, but she never hugged me when I failed a test, never asked what I actually wanted to study in college, and never once looked at me the way she looked at Caroline. Caroline, the daughter of Lauren's sister, moved in with us when I was 8. Her mother died of a stroke and her father remarried almost immediately after the funeral. Caroline was shipped from Chicago to Boston like a temporary package, but she never left. Soon she became the center of every family dinner. She studied ballet in Chicago, Lorraine said proudly during Caroline's 13th birthday party. She was selected for the principal performance group. My father gave a small nod, his expression unreadable. "That's great, Julia, you should watch Caroline rehearse and learn from her, all right?" I smiled, like I always did. But I remember clearly, I had abandoned the sketch I was working on, my very first assignment for an elective art class I'd secretly signed up for. Caroline was graceful, I'll give her that. She always carried herself with warmth, made adults feel important, and knew exactly how to say what they wanted to hear. But something in the way she looked at me, tilted head, narrowed eyes as if analyzing, sent chills down my spine. When I got selected for the school debate team, she was the first to hug me in congratulations. But that night, I overheard her tell Lorraine in the kitchen, "She's lucky. Aunt Lorraine helped her edit that speech." Lorraine didn't deny it, she only said softly, "She always needs a little extra guidance." So I learned to stay silent, learned to swallow my doubts. During dinners, when Lorraine asked Caroline about the Model UN conference at Yale, I quietly cut my bread. No one asked about the essay I'd just won an award for. When my father became busier with lectures and research, he left the household matters to Lorraine, and Lorraine made Caroline the family's worthy representative. I used to think I was too sensitive, that maybe I was jealous, or expecting too much from a stepmother who was doing her best. But some moments were too clear to ignore. When I was 14, I had a high fever, and missed school for a week. Lorraine took me to the doctor, but didn't go into the room with me. While I waited, I overheard the nurse ask, "Are you her birth mother or stepmother for the records?" Lorraine replied without hesitation, "Just a temporary guardian." I never forgot that sentence. I stayed silent for years. Even when I wanted to ask my father, I didn't. Because during the rare tea times we shared, he'd often gaze into the distance and say, "Lorraine did so much raising you after your mother passed. I owe her a lot." I couldn't bear being the daughter who made him choose sides, or the one who looked ungrateful for asking. But what hurt me most wasn't Lorraine. It wasn't Caroline either. It was the feeling of being quietly replaced. Bit by bit. Intentionally. As if I was a rough draft of something they needed but never truly wanted to keep. Christmas, the year I turned 25, my father passed away from a stroke. That was the day I truly felt like an outsider. Lorraine orchestrated a grand funeral, everything arranged with meticulous precision. I was assigned to read the eulogy, a version Lorraine had written herself. Caroline wore a black velvet dress, standing beside her mother, steadying her as she wept. "Julia, let Caroline share the childhood memories part," Lorraine said. "You didn't have as many anyway." I told myself, this is how she grieves, this is how she processes loss. But in truth, it was how she erased me from the story, layer by layer until even I questioned who I was in that house. Then Caroline officially moved in with Lorraine. They began discussing property investments, managing the scholarship funds in my father's name. I was encouraged to focus on my teaching career. Because not everyone is meant for big things. I had been silent for 36 years. Until that moment, standing in front of the slightly ajar door, when I heard Caroline say with her own mouth, "heart disease," about my mother's death. I knew. There were secrets never told. And I would be the one to uncover every layer of dust covering the truth they had buried for 3 decades. I didn't return to that house looking for answers. At first, I wanted to keep a piece of memory. An old photo album, a hand-embroidered curtain my mother had sewn, or anything that belonged to the time when I was still a naive child believing my family was the textbook example. The house in Lenox, the place my father used to call our summer retreat, had been closed for nearly 3 years. Lorraine decided to sell it after my father passed, saying, "The maintenance cost isn't practical for a place we barely use." I knew she'd signed with a brokerage firm, and the following week they'd be clearing out everything for listing. That's why I was there on a rainy Saturday. The key still fit perfectly in the lock, as if no one had ever tried to erase me from this doorway. I stepped over the weathered wooden threshold, the scent of dampness rising with the rattle of drafty window panes. There was the same frayed Persian rug, the deep brown leather armchair where my father used to read every afternoon, and the upright piano in the corner, where I'd learned to play Clair de Lune at 13. I walked straight into the small library. I didn't know why, but I always felt that room held more than it showed. On the wall, an old portrait of my great-grandfather hung slightly crooked. When I reached to straighten it, I noticed a strange scratch behind the frame, a faint square outline cut into the drywall. I froze, my heart pounding. I slid the painting fully aside. Behind it was a built-in wall safe, rusty but intact, still with a mechanical lock. I had never seen it before. The combination. I looked around, there wasn't a single note, but then I remembered. My birthday. The date my father always confused with his wedding anniversary. It had been a family joke. I spun the dial. 0627. A soft click echoed. I opened the heavy steel door. Inside was a sealed envelope, a tied bundle of documents, and a small wooden box. I sat on the floor, hands trembling as I opened the envelope first. Inside was a handwritten will, the unmistakable script of my father. The date at the top read August, the same year he died, only 3 weeks before his sudden stroke. I, Richard Sandoval, being of sound mind, hereby leave all of my personal estate, including the house in Lenox, shares in the Sandoval Foundation, and savings account number 84,761,294 at Boston Bank. To my biological daughter, Julia Maria Sandoval. All of it? I remembered clearly. In the official will reading, the lawyer said everything had been fairly divided between the widow and adopted daughter. When I asked about my individual share, Lorraine said, "Your father placed everything in a trust, and I'm the trustee." I had believed her. I had thought trustee meant temporary custodian, but this was the original will. Handwritten, signed, witnessed. I opened the bundle next. It was a collection of old letters, carefully preserved, each one slipped into a yellowed plastic sleeve. The handwriting was soft and slanted. My mother, Maria Elena. The first letter was dated 1989, a year before her death. "Margan, I know something's wrong. Richard comes home late, forgets special days. He laughs it off, but his eyes, they're not the same. I saw the way he looked at Lorraine. I'm not sure, but I think they're hiding something. The second, 3 months later. I confronted Richard, he denied everything. But Lorraine called me yesterday, tried to negotiate. Can you believe that? She wanted me to keep things quiet for Julia's sake. It made my skin crawl. I'm gathering evidence. I won't let my daughter grow up in a house built on lies. My throat tightened. I had never heard my mother's voice. Not once. Not outside of whispers from others. I opened the final letter. No envelope. The paper's edges were curled, the ink faded. The first line stole my breath. Margaret, if anything happens to me, please remember, it wasn't heart disease. I gripped the letter, palms slick with sweat. Every word, every stroke of ink ripped through everything I thought I knew about my childhood. It wasn't heart disease. Then what was it? I stayed there for a long time, back against the wall, letters scattered across the floor, the will clutched between my knees. The old house was still quiet as ever, but inside me something was breaking loose. Like a storm surfacing after 30 years of being buried beneath the ground. I held those letters from my mother the entire flight to Tucson, Arizona. Each time the sunlight hit the page, her slanted handwriting stabbed at me. Slowly, without blood, but burning deep in my chest. Carmen Elena, the only person my father ever mentioned in a guarded tone, was my mother's sister. I didn't remember ever meeting her. She lived in a small house on the edge of the desert, growing cacti in clay pots and hanging bamboo chimes from the porch. She opened the door after my second knock. Her silver hair was neatly twisted at the nape of her neck, and her deep brown eyes, etched with age, still held a piercing sharpness. When I said, "I'm Julia, Maria Elena's daughter," her hands froze mid-air. "Oh my God," she whispered, You've grown so much." I sat with her that whole afternoon in a kitchen that smelled of cinnamon and dried bay leaves. The letters lay on the table, each one pressed into plastic sleeves like I was trying to preserve the voice of a woman I'd never truly known. "I found these in a hidden safe behind a painting," I said, my voice breaking. "And my father's will, the handwritten one. He left everything to me. Not Lorraine? Not Caroline?" Carmen said nothing. She poured more tea into my cup, her fingers trembling slightly. "I've wanted to talk to you about this for so many years," she exhaled, her voice lower now. "But your father and Lorraine did everything they could to sever ties. When Maria passed, I didn't even get to Boston before the funeral was over. No one told me, officially." I clenched my hands in my lap. "My mother, she didn't die of heart disease, did she?" Carmen looked straight at me. Her eyes didn't flinch. "No. She didn't." She stood and retrieved an old wooden box from the cupboard, placing a thin file in front of me. "This is a copy of the initial medical report I managed to keep. A nurse at the hospital, an old classmate, secretly gave it to me. It clearly states, no history of heart conditions, no signs of stroke." I flipped through it. The recorded cause of death, cranial trauma due to blunt force impact to the occipital lobe. No signs of struggle, no evidence of slipping. What really happened? Carmen gripped the armrest tightly. "Your mother found out Richard was having an affair with Lorraine. She was heartbroken, but she didn't make a scene. She quietly prepared the divorce papers. On the day she planned to file them, she went to the courthouse, but never made it inside. That same day, Lorraine came to the house. That night Maria fell down the stairs. She died on the spot. I felt the blood in my body freeze." "You never believed it was an accident?" Carmen shook her head slowly. "Never, but when I raised questions, Lorraine hired a lawyer who sent a letter threatening to sue me for defamation and demanded damages. I was an elementary school teacher back then. No money, no power. They had the whole system behind them, and you were so little. I was scared, Julia. I was scared I'd lose you too if I pushed it." I bit my lip until it bled. In my head echoed something Lorraine once said to me when I was 15, after I accidentally spilled wine on Caroline's dress. "Julia, you're as clumsy as your mother." A line I once thought was casual. Hearing it now, it cut like a blade. "Did you know my mother planned to fight for custody of me?" "I did. Carmen nodded. She didn't want to leave you with your father, especially not after she realized how often Lorraine was around during those work trips. Maria wanted to bring you back to Arizona, start over. I dropped my head onto the table, shoulders shaking. All these years I'd wondered why I always felt left out in my own family. Turns out I was never chosen to belong. Everything I thought was childhood was the backdrop to a tragedy they tried to cover up under the word stability. My father... I hesitated. Did he know about the conflict between Lorraine and my mom? He did, but he stayed silent. After Maria died, he had someone contact me, told me everything was settled, don't interfere. After that, no one from your family called again. You stopped appearing in Christmas cards. I sent letters, photos, but never got a response. The last time I saw you was a picture in the paper when you got into college. The final pieces fell into place. My mother had tried to protect me, but she didn't have time, and everyone else had spent their lives making sure I forgot she ever existed. I looked up at Carmen, my voice hoarse. Do you think Lorraine had something to do with my mother's death? Carmen didn't answer right away. She pulled a small photo from the wooden box. A picture of my mother holding me in her arms, her long black hair falling over her shoulders, her gentle smile like the first sunlight of spring. I don't know who pushed, but I do know who stood to gain. I clutched the photo. For the first time in my life, my mother wasn't just a vague concept tied to death. She was someone who had loved me, who tried to reclaim me, who wrote letters asking for help, and died before she could do it. I returned to Boston with a suitcase full of letters, document copies, and a fire burning inside me. But this time I wasn't coming back as a daughter searching for closure. I came back as a survivor, a witness to the truth, and ready to be the one who would hold them accountable. The first person I called was Harper Kim, my best friend from college, now a data analyst for a tech consulting firm. Harper once helped me pass constitutional law by turning the textbook into color-coded charts, and now she was sitting in my kitchen, sipping iced coffee from a mug that read, "Not Today, Manipulators." Here's the deal, Harper said, pushing up her glasses. If you want to find evidence, we need to dig into what they think you'll never check. Personal emails, transaction history, temp file folders. Stuff they thought was deleted but isn't, if they didn't clean it properly. I handed her the old laptop Derek used, the one I thought was for private project work but was always locked with a password. The password was our wedding date plus the house number. He never suspected a thing. Harper typed rapidly, barely blinking. Half an hour later, she turned the screen toward me. A list of emails appeared, fragmented but clear. Temporary contract. Lorraine's share. Property title transfer. Needs confirmation before June. Draft. Marriage docs. Backup. I stared as Harper opened one with the subject, "Final step before Julia finds out." Sender. Caroline Whitmore. Recipient. Derek Whitmore. If she finds the original will, just say it was a draft and never finalized. I've secured Kellerman. The lawyer owes my mother a favor. The Lennox house title must be transferred before end of quarter. If she shows up at the notary office, you know what to say. The Sandoval Foundation share sale will finalize after next month's board vote. I have enough shareholder numbers locked in. Bottom line, end the marriage cleanly. Leave her a few assets to feel proud of keeping. The rest belongs to us. And remember, if this blows up, I'll say you pressured me. My stomach turned. Harper said nothing, just placed a hand gently on my shoulder. There's more, she said later. They created a cloud storage folder disguised as event planning. Inside is a scanned copy of the stock transfer agreement. Digital signatures from Caroline and Derek. I clenched my fists. So they've started moving assets without informing me, the rightful heir? And that's illegal if you have the original will. The problem is, Lawyer Kellerman... I didn't wait long. The very next morning I went to the law office where my father had originally drafted his will, and for the first time I met Noah Gaines, an independent investigative attorney Harper had recommended. Noah was around 40, tall, neatly cropped brown hair, voice steady and deliberate. He didn't ask if I was sure. He just asked, "Do you have the evidence? The original documents, handwritten confirmation, banking info?" I opened my bag and laid everything on the table. Noah flipped through each sheet, eyes never leaving the page. When he got to my mother's final letter, he paused longer. "This line," he whispered, "if anything happens to me, it wasn't heart disease." He looked up at me. "This isn't just a case of disputed inheritance, Ms. Julia. This could be a cover-up. And if what Harper found is accurate, then Derek and Caroline conspired to illegally seize assets, committed potential contract fraud, and violated power of attorney law." I swallowed hard. "I want them to pay." This wasn't only about reclaiming what was mine. It was about honoring what she was never allowed to protect. "Then we do this by the book. No emotion, no rush. Every piece of evidence must be properly documented." I began recording conversations, even ones that seemed harmless. Derek often called me from the office, asking if I could find the old notarized file or remember whose name was still on the Lennox title. I played dumb so he'd say more. Caroline was more cautious, but I deliberately texted questions like, "What do you think if I reopen Dad's old will?" "Caroline, no need, everything was processed properly. You should focus on what Derek left for you." I saved every reply. I also recorded a fake family meeting Lorraine arranged, under the pretense of rebuilding after the tension. During dinner, she slipped and said, "Your father once said he'd leave most things to you, but then he changed his mind after you got married. Letting Derek help manage the estate made more sense." It sounded casual, but the message was layered with intrusion and manipulation. I gave the recording to Noah. He smiled faintly. "We're getting somewhere." We were building a wall of evidence, each brick a lie uncovered, each letter, each deleted email, each forged signature, slowly forming a clear picture. This wasn't betrayal, it was a plan, and I was the most precisely calculated target. I got a call from Caroline on a Tuesday afternoon. Her voice over the phone was sweet, almost too sweet. "Julia, can we meet? I think it's time we talked." Like family. Family. That word, coming from Caroline's mouth, sounded as out of place as laughter at a funeral. I agreed, not because I hoped for an apology, but because I needed them to reveal exactly who they were, right in front of the tiny recorder tucked inside my purse. We met at my place, a small apartment in South Boston, where I had moved after leaving the house I once shared with Derek. I made chamomile tea, set the wooden table in the living room, and played soft instrumental music in the background. Just enough to make them drop their guard. Lorraine arrived first. She wore a beige coat, a silk scarf around her neck. Her posture was still commanding, but I noticed her steps were slower and her eyes carried caution. Caroline followed, wearing sunglasses even though it was already dusk. She sat across from me, took off her glasses, and placed her purse on her lap, fingers interlaced. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," Lorraine began. "I know there have been a lot of misunderstandings lately, and honestly, I hope we can bring the tension down. We're a family, sweetheart. No matter what happens, we're still kin." I didn't respond. I poured tea for all three of us, moving gently as if this meeting was nothing more than a quiet reunion. Caroline glanced around the room, her gaze brushing over the paintings on the wall, the folder stack on the shelf, and the leather bag near my chair, where the recorder was running. "I understand that you're upset," Caroline said, her tone slow like reading from a script. "I've also felt hurt by things that happened between all of us, but Julia, you're letting emotion cloud all the years we grew up together." I gave a subtle look, placing my teacup down on the porcelain saucer with a soft clink. "I'm not upset," I said. "I'm listening." "Then let me speak from the heart. I raised you like my own. Every meal, every school pickup, every fever in the night. I was the one there. Your birth mother, she may have given birth to you, but I'm the one who raised you." I looked directly at her. Then why did my birth mother die without explanation? The question rang through the room like shattering glass. Lorraine paused, her eyes shifting to Caroline. "Sweetheart, that was a long time ago, and any accident is tragic. We shouldn't shouldn't bring it up," I interrupted, "because it's inconvenient, or because the truth might unravel everything you worked so hard to construct." Caroline exhaled, lips pressed tight. Then, with her usual arrogance, she tilted her head toward me, her voice sharpening. You're turning this into some kind of personal tragedy. Your mother died in an accident. No one meant for it to happen, but if she had listened to me that day, none of this would have happened. Listen to you about what? Carolyn blinked. Then, as if she couldn't take it back, she let it slip. She should have let me handle it from the start. Lorraine turned sharply to Caroline. What did you say? Nothing. Caroline pulled back instantly. I mean, handle the rumors. The questions from extended family. When Julia's mother passed, of course people would wonder if things weren't tied up neatly. A breeze slid through the door crack. The music still played. The recorder is still running, I said evenly. I thought you should know that. Silence flooded the room. Caroline's face froze like stone. Lorraine stood abruptly, her chair screeching against the hardwood floor. What are you doing? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. I'm protecting the truth, I said. The truth my mother left in her final letter. If anything happens to me, it wasn't heart disease. Lorraine took a shaky step back. Caroline stared at me like I had betrayed something sacred. Julia, Lorraine said, trying to soften her tone. We're family. We can resolve this privately. No need for lawyers. No need for court. Family? I repeated. Then when my mother died, who in this family investigated? When I was taken away from everything she left behind, who in this family protected me? When assets were quietly transferred, who in this family called to even ask if I knew? I pulled out my phone, opened the recording app, and hit save. Today's conversation will serve as evidence, I said gently, more a statement than a threat. I don't need confessions. I just need them to reveal themselves. Caroline stood, her voice cold as steel. You're cutting yourself out of this bloodline. I was never in it. Lorraine lowered her head, eyes fixed on the cold tea. When she looked back up, the pride in her gaze had vanished, replaced by something that looked very much like fear. What are you going to do next? She asked. I looked them both in the eye, no blinking. What my mother didn't live long enough to do. I'm taking back her name, and justice for both of us. I chose a Thursday morning to reconvene the board meeting of the Sandoval Foundation, the name my father once wore with pride, but which had been slowly eroded over the past decade by undeserving hands. The foundation's headquarters sat in a historic building in downtown Boston. Gray stone walls, towering glass doors, a grand marble lobby that gleamed under the morning light. I never thought I'd return here. At least not as the rightful heir, but today I walked in as someone with the power to put the truth back on the table. Not with oaths, but with evidence. Noah walked beside me, footsteps steady, carrying a briefcase full of certified documents. Harper was already in the tech booth preparing the data presentation. And me, I wore a black suit, my hair pinned back, no makeup on. I wanted them to see me clearly, not the soft-spoken daughter they once controlled, but someone who had risen from her mother's ashes. The main conference room was packed. Over 50 shareholders were present, most of them longtime acquaintances of my father. A few journalists had been invited through the most legitimate means possible. Derek sat in the second row next to Caroline. She wore a white dress and gray blazer, her eyes constantly scanning the room. Lorraine was nowhere to be seen, but I knew she would show up, true to the style of someone who always needed to control the narrative. The moderator invited me to the podium. My name is Julia Sandoval, I began, voice steady, eyes sweeping across the faces in front of me. I am the only legal daughter of Richard Sandoval, founder of the Sandoval Foundation. A few murmurs rippled through the crowd. I continued. Recently, changes were made to the foundation's ownership structure, share transfers and assets, conducted without transparency, without board approval, and most importantly, without reference to any legitimate will. I signaled. Noah stepped forward, opened his briefcase, and handed me the top document from a thick stack. This is the original will, signed and legally notarized by my father. It clearly states that full ownership and control of the foundation would be transferred to me upon my 25th birthday. A backstage technician projected a scan of the will onto the large screen. The entire room fell silent. However, I continued, a second will, fabricated, was used to reassign assets to others. Please direct your attention to the signature comparison. Harper controlled the display. 2 signatures, one from the real will, one from the forged, appeared side by side. At the same time, I displayed an expert analysis from a handwriting verification specialist. Below is an audio recording between 2 individuals discussing how to deal with the estate before Julia gets suspicious. Quoted directly. I pressed play. Caroline's voice came through first, crystal clear. If she finds out, everything we've worked for goes up in smoke. I told you it has to be done cleanly. Transfer everything to my name and then... Derek's voice followed, low but unmistakably complicit. But what if the old will gets discovered? And that whole stairwell thing back then? I stopped the recording. The room remained utterly silent. Caroline shot up from her chair. That's fake! I never said that. Someone edited it. I looked directly at her. All data was legally obtained, stored through proper procedures, and reviewed by an independent legal expert. Murmurs escalated into chaotic whispers. Several shareholders pulled out their phones to record. An elderly woman, once my father's longtime assistant, spoke up. Oh my God, I had my doubts, but I never imagined they'd actually do it. Right then, the rear doors burst open. Lorraine entered, pale as a ghost. She only managed a few steps before collapsing in the middle of the hall. Paramedics arrived in time and carried her out. Caroline looked panicked, eyes darting everywhere, but when 2 officers approached with a summons, she froze, her body stiffening. I was following my aunt's orders. She told me to do it. I wasn't the mastermind. The officer calmly replied, Your statement will be recorded at headquarters. Caroline was escorted away, leaving behind a room filled with stunned, suspicious eyes and something that felt almost like cleansing. I arrived at the holding facility on a drizzly afternoon, carrying a signed copy of the divorce papers and a complete asset statement. They gave me 15 minutes in a private meeting room. No glass divider, no guard present. Maybe because Derek hadn't been formally charged yet, or maybe someone in the system still thought we were husband and wife. He entered looking nothing like the man I used to know. Hair messy, wrinkled shirt, deep circles under his eyes like he hadn't slept in a week. But the look in his eyes hadn't changed. Part regret, part calculation. Watching every flicker of my expression like a poker game not yet over. I didn't come here to hear an apology, I said without greeting him. Derek gave a weak smile. I figured, but I still want you to understand. It wasn't what you think. What do I think? I crossed my arms and leaned back. I really did love you, Julia, he said, voice softening. At first I had no idea Caroline had any kind of plan. But when it became clear you might inherit most of the Sandoval Foundation, she proposed something mutually beneficial. I laughed. Cold and sharp. You sound like a broker, not a husband. I didn't know it would go this far. He avoided my gaze. It started with organizing a few documents, making sure you wouldn't suspect anything. But then, things spun out of control. No, Derek. I spoke slowly. Things don't spin out of control. You chose to lie. You chose Caroline, not because you loved me, but because you thought I'd never find out. He bit his lower lip lightly. I admit I was wrong, but if I could go back, you'd hide it better, I cut in. A long silence stretched between us. I pulled a blue folder from my bag. This is the divorce filing. And here is a list of all assets under my name. From the Brooklyn apartment to the shares I contributed to the Sandoval Foundation before we got married. Everything's been reviewed and confirmed by my attorney. He looked at the papers like they were a sentence. You're not going to let me explain any further? You had 3 years to explain, Derek, but you used that time pretending to be a devoted husband while secretly negotiating legacy optimization behind my back. I leaned back, calm but final. I don't need to hear any more versions of this story. Caroline won't take the fall for all of this. He tried to keep his voice steady. She's better at escaping than you think. I don't care how Caroline gets out of this. I care that I'm no longer the one you people can use as a stepping stone. Derek's gaze started to drop. He looked like he wanted to say something more, but I stood up. I didn't come here to make peace. I came to confirm that, From this moment forward, I have no ties to you. Not legally, not emotionally. I turned and walked away, leaving him sitting in that cold, gray room. No tears, no drama, just release. Quiet and final, like signing your name at the bottom of a voided contract. Not because the pain had ended, but because I chose not to let it control me anymore. I didn't return to the old apartment. I didn't go back to any office that once bore the Sandoval name. Instead, I rented a small space on the third floor of a red brick building near East Village. Once a World War II sewing factory, now quiet and filled with light. That room became the beginning of the Maria Elena Fund. I named it after my mother, a woman who never stepped foot in a boardroom, but was the one who quietly signed the first investment checks for her husband, gave up her dream of studying law to raise a daughter in a family that never once called her name with respect. On opening day there was no ribbon-cutting ceremony, no media. It was a quiet gathering of a few women I had quietly helped throughout the legal process. They were women forced by their families to give up inheritance, cheated by brothers or uncles with voluntary transfers, or simply dismissed because they were daughters in families where only sons got to decide. Not everyone can afford a lawyer, I told the first group of staffers, but everyone deserves to know the truth about ownership, justice, and their worth, not as defined by relatives or the past. I used most of the recovered assets to establish 3 sub-funds, one for legal aid, one for mental health support, and one for financial independence training. Each month we hosted workshops, from how to read contracts to how to verify land titles, bank accounts, and wills, things that should have been taught early but were kept hidden in many households. Then one spring evening, after finishing our first full course, I returned to my new apartment, a small, warm place with a balcony full of lavender, and opened my laptop to write the first line. I am the daughter of a woman who was silenced her whole life, and of a man who believed power could be disguised as family honor. That was the opening line of The Daughter Who Remembered. I wrote it late at night, when the city was asleep and my mother's memory no longer stung like a scar, but glowed like a guiding light. I didn't write to accuse. I wrote to trace the journey of a woman who had once lost herself in the hearts of those who claimed to love her and who reclaimed her name. Not through applause, but through her own voice. When the book was published, I didn't expect much, only that it might reach someone who'd felt like the outsider in their family. What I didn't anticipate was the response from the legal community. They began sharing the story, citing it in conferences, sending non-stop interview requests. A documentary producer named Jordan Spencer approached me after a panel talk. He proposed to capture the journey, not as sensational drama, but as a tribute to those who'd been erased from their family histories. The film, Bloodline and Silence, premiered at a civil justice conference in Chicago. In a hushed auditorium, I sat in the last row, watching as my mother's faded photographs filled the screen alongside her diary words. The day she learned to write her name, I silently promised no one would ever define her worth but herself. After the screening, an older woman approached me. She wore a beige knit coat and held a copy of my book. "My daughter sent me this," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I was the one who made her give up her share of the estate, because I believed girls don't need land. Now, I'm trying to make it right. Thank you for speaking for so many who never got the chance." I took her hand and gently squeezed it. No words were needed. The Maria Elena Fund began receiving support from independent organizations. From that small office, we opened 2 more branches, one in San Antonio and one in Minneapolis. But what moved me most wasn't the growth. It was the handwritten letters, from strangers, sent in just to say, "I saw myself in your story. I'm not a revolutionary. I'm not trying to be anyone's symbol. I'm just a daughter who was once told to forget and now chooses to remember. Not to feed bitterness, but to protect the parts of myself that were buried beneath the titles of good daughter, loyal wife, or woman who shouldn't ask for too much." And for the first time in my life, I saw my mother, not as someone who had passed, but as someone still living with me, in every sentence, every story, every woman who found the courage to speak. One crisp morning in early fall, yellow leaves had just begun to scatter along the stone path leading to an old cemetery outside Hudson Valley. I stood before my mother's grave, Maria Elena Sandoval, where the headstone had recently been revised at my request. A mother silenced, a daughter who remembered. Below that, a smaller line I'd asked to add. The truth doesn't need to shout. It only needs to be acknowledged. I placed a bouquet of lavender and white chrysanthemums on the damp soil. The breeze stirred gently, enough to lift the hem of my coat. I'm not here to cry anymore, I said, eyes fixed on the misted granite. I'm here to tell you what you once wished someone had said to you, that you deserved to be seen, that your quiet love was not meaningless, that I have lived, not as a footnote in a family legacy but as myself. I placed my hand on the stone, the other hand holding the wool scarf my mother had once started to knit. I'd kept it all these years, and last winter I finished it. Each stitch following the same pattern she left behind. After a few minutes of silence, I turned to the man standing beside me. Noah looked at me with quiet calm, waiting. He didn't ask questions. He didn't rush. We'd come a long way together. From a legal partner, a man who once believed justice only lived in documents and clauses, to someone who understood it also lived in memory. And trust. I'm ready. We walked along the path out of the cemetery, dry leaves rustling beneath our steps. Noah took my hand without a word. He knew I needed silence. Not out of discomfort, but out of reverence. At the old iron gate where our car was parked, I turned for one last look. The small angel statue beside my mother's grave had been cleaned, its wings no longer streaked with moss. I remembered my first visit here. The headstone had even listed my mother's name incorrectly, shortened and sanitized to fit the family standard. It took me nearly a year to track down her original birth certificate, and 2 more to petition the court to correct her official records. Not because I believed a name could change fate, but because I believed every woman deserves to be called by her rightful name. On the drive back to the city, I leaned my head against the car window. Red and gold forests blurred past like an old film reel, reminding me of autumns long gone. I didn't speak much. There was no pain, no anger, only quiet, like a door, stuck for years, finally opening without a sound. As we approached the Brooklyn Heights turnoff, Noah spoke up. What do you think your mother would say if she could hear you today? I hesitated. I don't think she'd say much. Maybe just ask if I've eaten. Then remind me to wear an extra layer because the air's getting cold? We laughed, soft and genuine. I looked at him, then back out the window. And if I asked her, "Are you angry that I dug all this up?" Maybe she'd say no. I'm proud you had the courage to name the things I never could. That evening, as the sun dipped westward, I sat in the living room of my new apartment. On the table were final drafts for an upcoming high school program, Law and Personal Rights for Young Women, hosted by the Maria Elena Fund. I sipped tea and looked at the light hitting an old photograph I'd recently framed, my mother, young, standing in front of a wooden house, hair pinned high, eyes both stern and gentle. I whispered in my heart, "I've lived, for you, for me, and for the ones still afraid to speak." And in that moment, I didn't feel like I was standing in the ruins of a collapsed family, but at the threshold of something solid, honest, and wholly mine. Another door, another life. No permission needed, no waiting in line. Maybe all of us carry forgotten pieces, an unspoken name, a discarded dream, or a truth hidden too long. My story isn't unique. It might be a mirror reflecting something in you, a wound, a quiet fight, or a moment you finally chose to live as your true self. What do you think about Julia's journey? Have you ever felt defined by someone else and had to go far to find your real name again? Leave a comment below because sometimes one shared story is the first step toward healing many others. If you want to follow more stories about family, memory, and those who were forgotten, but never truly gone, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more deep and honest narratives to come.